The trestle gave way at 2:30 in the afternoon, and every soul in Jasper Creek heard it die. The sound carried across the frozen valley like the groan of some great beast surrendering to the cold, a drawn-out shriek of iron and timber that ended in a thunderous crack echoing off the mountains. November 17th, 1887, the temperature standing at 12 degrees below zero and falling with the afternoon light. 847 souls watched from porches and storefronts as the railroad bridge that connected them to the outside world folded inward upon itself, ice-laden beams snapping like kindling, the whole structure collapsing into the frozen gulch below. Mayor Harlan Briggs stood on the platform of the depot, his breath coming in white plumes, his face gone the color of old ash. The morning supply train had been due in 3 days. Now it would not come at all, not until spring thaw at the earliest, and spring was 4 months distant. The town's granary held perhaps 3 weeks of fodder. The general store's inventory showed 17 barrels of flour, 9 of salt pork, 4 of molasses. The livery counted 62 horses within town limits, not including those on outlying farms. 62 horses, and 3 weeks of feed to divide among them. "God help us," the mayor said, and the wind snatched his words away. Thaddeus Blackwood heard the trestle fall from his land 2 miles east of town, where the sandstone bluffs rose like the bones of the earth exposed to sky. He had been inside the cliff when it happened, hanging lanterns along the back wall of his stable, and the sound reached him muffled and strange, as though the mountain itself had shuddered. His strawberry roan mare Pebble lifted her head from the water trough, ears pricking forward, and Thaddeus set down his hammer. "Easy, girl," he said, running a calloused hand along her neck. Her winter coat had come in thick as beaver pelt, weeks earlier than any horse he had ever known, and he had understood what that meant. He had tried to tell them. They had not listened. He walked to the entrance of his stable and looked out across the valley, toward the thin column of dust and debris still rising where the trestle had stood. The cold pressed against his face like a hand made of knives. He pulled his collar higher and turned back inside, where the earth held its warmth against the murderous sky. Thaddeus had come to Jasper Creek 8 years prior. A boy of 19, with nothing to his name but a worn canvas rucksack, a leather tool roll that had belonged to his father, and a way of looking at land that made other men shake their heads in confusion. He had arrived on the morning coach from Helena, stepping down into the mud of Main Street with the dust of 300 miles still coating his clothes, and the first thing he had done was walk to the edge of town and stare at the cliffs. The land agent, a portly fellow named Hutchins, who smelled of tobacco and hair oil, had followed him out of pure curiosity. "Nothing out there worth looking at," Hutchins had said, mopping his brow despite the autumn chill. "That cliff face has been surveyed 6 times. No mineral value, no timber, no water rights worth the paper. 60 acres of vertical nothing." Thaddeus had not answered. He was studying the way the bluff faced south, the way the sandstone layered itself in clean horizontal bands, the slight overhang at the top that would shed rain and snow away from any opening carved below. He was seeing what his father had taught him to see, back in the high valleys of the Swiss Alps where the Blackwood men had sheltered livestock in mountain caves for 4 generations. "How much?" Thaddeus had asked. Hutchins had laughed, a wet, incredulous sound. $7 would take it off the county's hands. "But son, you would be throwing your money into a hole." "I mean to make a hole," Thaddeus had said, and paid the $7 in coin. His father, Heinrich Blackwood, had died 5 years before that day, when Thaddeus was 14 years old. The avalanche had come in February on a morning so clear and still that neither of them had suspected danger until the mountain spoke. They had been climbing to check on a high pasture shelter, a cave Heinrich had spent 3 summers carving into the granite above the tree line, and the snow had simply let go above them without warning. Thaddeus had survived because his father shoved him into a rock crevice and covered the opening with his own body. He had lain in that darkness for 6 hours, his father's weight pressing down on him, listening to the silence that meant Heinrich Blackwood would never speak again. When the rescue party finally dug him out, they found the boy had not wept. He had simply looked at his father's peaceful face, then reached into the dead man's coat and removed the leather tool roll, the one that held the chisels and picks that had carved shelters into alpine stone for 100 years. The earth endures, his father had told him the day he first placed a chisel in Thaddeus's young hand. Build with her. Those words had carried him across an ocean and halfway across a continent to a sandstone bluff in Montana Territory that other men called worthless. He had purchased Pebble from a rancher outside Helena for $12, choosing her not for her unusual coloring, but for the intelligence in her eyes and the sureness of her step on rocky ground. She had walked beside him the whole way to Jasper Creek, and she had been the first living creature to enter the cliff stable when he finished it, stepping inside as though she had always known such a place existed. The carving began in the spring of his 2nd year in Jasper Creek, after he had spent 12 months observing the land, mapping the cliff face, testing the sandstone with his father's chisels. He worked alone, beginning each day before dawn and continuing until his arms could no longer lift the tools. The blasting powder came from the Mercantile in Helena, 40 cents per stick, and he used it sparingly, preferring the slow certainty of handwork to the violence of explosions. The first winter of carving yielded 12 feet of tunnel, a passage barely wide enough for a horse to pass, the walls rough with chisel marks. He had to stop when the cold came, retreating to a sod dugout he had built at the base of the cliff. But he returned to the work the moment the spring thaw softened the ground. The second winter of carving doubled his progress. By the following spring, the stable extended 40 feet into the hillside, opening into a chamber 20 feet wide and 10 feet tall, the sandstone walls smooth now from his careful labor. The timber beams came from an abandoned mine shaft 4 miles to the north, salvaged in the summer of his 3rd year. He borrowed a mule from the one farmer who would speak to him, a taciturn Swedish widower named Lindqvist, and spent 3 weeks hauling beams across rough terrain. Each beam measured 8 feet in length and 6 inches square, solid pine that had been meant to shore up silver tunnels that never produced a single ore. He notched and fitted them himself, creating a framework that would hold even if the mountain shifted. The water came from the earth itself, a natural spring he discovered while carving the back wall, a seep of cold, clear water that he channeled into a stone trough he had shaped with his own hands. The insulation came from packed earth and straw, filling the gaps between sandstone and timber, creating pockets of dead air that trapped warmth the way his father had taught him. The feed storage bins were carved directly into the rock, lined with salvage cedar that would keep grain dry and free from vermin. Total cost, by his careful accounting, $127 in materials, plus 4,200 hours of solitary labor spread across 2 winters and the seasons between them. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Jasper Creek was not a place where a man could disappear into a cliff for 2 years without drawing comment. They saw him hauling powder and timber along the south road. They heard the muffled reports of his blasting on still mornings. They watched him emerge from the sandstone at dusk, coated in red dust, his hands calloused and his clothes worn through at the knees. At first, the attention came as simple curiosity. Miners drifting through town would stop to watch him work, offering opinions on his technique or the quality of his stone. Farmers would pause their wagons on the road to shake their heads at the sight of a young man disappearing into a mountain with a lantern and a chisel. But curiosity curdled into something sharper as the stable took shape. When Thaddeus led Pebble inside for the first time, letting her drink from the underground spring while the summer heat pressed down on the valley, the talk shifted from bemusement to scorn. Niels Coldwell delivered his verdict on a Saturday evening in the saloon, his voice carrying across 3 tables of listening ears. Coldwell had built every respectable structure in Jasper Creek, from the church steeple to the bank vault, and his opinion carried weight. "The boy has lost whatever sense God gave him," Coldwell declared, setting down his whiskey with a solid thump. "Any fool who puts horses underground deserves to bury himself with them. His father clearly died before teaching him sense." Laughter rippled through the room, and someone repeated the words to someone else, and by Sunday morning the nickname had spread through town like a contagion. The Mole Man. They said it to his face the first time he entered the general store after Coldwell's pronouncement. Ezra Polk, the proprietor, looked up from his ledger with something between pity and contempt. "Cash only for you, from now on, Mole Man. Store credit is for folks who build above ground like Christians." Thaddeus counted out coins for his flour and salt without comment. He had expected something like this. His father had faced similar scorn in the old country, from men who called the Blackwood Caves follies and tombs, right up until the winter of 1847, when a 3-week blizzard killed every head of livestock on the mountain, except those sheltered in Blackwood stone. Coldwell's wife proved more thorough than her husband. She organized the women of the town with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops, and by harvest time Thaddeus found himself excluded from every social gathering that mattered. The harvest dance came and went without an invitation. The church social passed him by. Even the widow Morrison, who had once brought him fresh bread as a kindness to a motherless young man, now crossed the street when she saw him coming. "They are saying you have gone strange," Lindqvist told him one evening, the Swede's weathered face unreadable. "They are saying the cliff has taken your wits." Thaddeus had been brushing Pebble in the last light of day, her coat already thickening against a winter still months distant. He paused, considering his words. "Let them measure my work against theirs," he said finally, "when the cold comes for what they love." Lindqvist said nothing more that evening, but he did not leave either. He stood with his arms folded across his chest, watching Thaddeus work the brush through Pebble's coat, and when darkness finally drove them both toward shelter, the Swede offered a single nod before turning his wagon toward home. That nod stayed with Thaddeus through the weeks that followed, a small acknowledgment that not every soul in Jasper Creek had turned against him. Small comfort, perhaps, but comfort nonetheless. The autumn of 1886 brought the final phase of his work. The stable itself stood complete, 40 feet of carved sanctuary extending into the living rock. But Thaddeus understood that shelter alone would not sustain life through a hard winter. His father had taught him that a cave without provisions was merely a tomb with better insulation, and so he turned his attention to the question of storage. The feed bins required 3 weeks of additional carving, hollowing out alcoves along the northern wall of the chamber where the sandstone ran dense and dry. Each bin measured 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, and 5 feet tall, large enough to hold 200 pounds of grain when packed properly. He lined them with cedar planks salvaged from the same abandoned mine that had provided his timber beams, fitting each piece with the care of a cabinet maker, sealing the joints with pine pitch heated over a small fire at the cave's entrance. The cost of cedar came to $14, purchased from a mill outside Helena that did not know his reputation. The pitch cost nothing but labor, tapped from pines on his own land and rendered down over low heat until it flowed like honey. The work itself took 140 hours by his careful count, carved into the soft sandstone one chisel stroke at a time. When the bins stood complete, he began filling them. Grain came dear in Jasper Creek, especially for a man who could not purchase on credit. Thaddeus made the journey to Helena 3 times that autumn, each trip consuming 4 days of travel, returning with his wagon loaded to the sideboard with oats and barley purchased at prices that would have made Ezra Polk weep with envy. The Helena merchants cared nothing for nicknames or reputations. They cared only for coin, and Thaddeus paid in coin, counting out dollars earned through odd jobs and careful frugality, money saved by living in a sod dugout while other men built proper houses. $63 in grain by the time the first hard frost came, another 18 in salt and dried goods, 11 more in lamp oil, candles, and the thick wool blankets he hung across the stable entrance to trap warmth inside. The townsfolk watched his preparations with the same contemptuous curiosity they had shown his carving. When his wagon rolled through Main Street loaded with feed sacks, Niels Coldwell stepped out of the saloon and called across the muddy thoroughfare. "Stocking your burrow for winter, mole man? Planning to hibernate with the gophers?" His companions laughed. 3 men who built above ground like Christians, who kept their horses in proper barns with proper walls and proper roofs that would buckle like paper under the weight of what was coming. Thaddeus did not answer. He clicked his tongue, and Pebble leaned into her traces, drawing the wagon forward without breaking stride. He had learned long ago that words wasted on deaf ears served no purpose. Let them laugh. The cold would answer for him when it came. But the mockery grew sharper as October bled into November. Coldwell had always possessed a gift for public cruelty, a way of crafting insults that stuck in the memory and spread through conversation like disease. He refined his attacks with the same care Thaddeus applied to his stonework, each new barb more memorable than the last. "I hear the mole man reads horsehair now," Coldwell announced at the saloon one evening, loud enough for every ear in the room to catch. "Sits out there feeling his mare's coat and claiming he can predict the weather. Perhaps next he will divine fortunes from manure. Step right up, gentlemen. Have your future told by a man who lives in a hole in the ground." The laughter that followed carried a mean edge, the sound of men finding pleasure in another's humiliation. By morning, half the town had heard some version of the story, embellished and exaggerated until Thaddeus had become a figure of pure absurdity, a cautionary tale about what happened when a man spent too long alone with his strange ideas. Coldwell's wife proved equally skilled at her particular form of warfare. Martha Coldwell organized the social fabric of Jasper Creek with iron efficiency, coordinating quilting circles and church committees and the 1,000 small gatherings that bound a frontier community together. She wielded exclusion like a surgeon's blade, cutting Thaddeus from every thread of connection with precise and deliberate strokes. "We cannot have him at the harvest social," she told the other women, her voice pitched to carry exactly as far as she intended. "Imagine the smell. Living in dirt like an animal, keeping horses underground like some kind of heathen. What would the children think?" The widow Morrison, who had once brought Thaddeus fresh bread, nodded her agreement. Whatever kindness she had once felt had curdled in the face of sustained social pressure, transformed into a careful distance that pained Thaddeus more than open hostility would have. He had liked the widow. She had reminded him, in small ways, of his mother, dead these 20 years from a fever that had swept through their alpine village like the wrath of God. Now she crossed the street when she saw him coming, her eyes fixed on some middle distance that allowed her to pretend he did not exist. The general store became a gauntlet of whispered comments and pointed silences. Ezra Polk maintained his cash-only policy with obvious satisfaction, counting Thaddeus's coins with exaggerated care as though expecting counterfeits. The other customers would drift toward the edges of the room when Thaddeus entered, creating a space around him like the clearing around a contagion. He bore it in silence. He had no choice. The evening before the trestle collapsed, Thaddeus stood alone in his cliff stable, a single lantern casting golden light across the sandstone walls. Pebble dozed in her stall, one hind hoof cocked in the easy rest of a horse who knew herself safe, her breath making small clouds in the cool underground air. The temperature inside held steady at 52 degrees, the same as it had held since summer, the same as it would hold when the world outside turned murderous. He spoke to her then, as he often did, his voice soft in the stone silence. "They think I have lost my wits," he said, running his hand along her shoulder. "They think I am building a tomb." Pebble's ears flicked toward his voice, though she did not lift her head. "But you know what is coming, do you not, girl? Your coat tells the story plain enough. Thick as I have ever seen it, and early besides. The elk came down from the high country 6 weeks ago. The pine bark on the north slopes has grown twice its usual thickness. Even the birds have gone strange, the last of the geese flying south before October ended." He paused, his hand resting on her warm flank. "My father saw winters like this in the old country. The winter of '47, when the snow came and did not stop for 3 weeks, when men froze in their beds and livestock died standing. His father's caves saved 200 head that year. 200 head of cattle, sheep, and horses, all standing warm in the dark while the world turned white and silent above them." Pebble shifted her weight, pressing slightly into his hand. "I tried to tell them," Thaddeus continued, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "I told the Morrison family. I told the Henleys. I told 3 families who would listen, and all 3 laughed. Coldwell called me a fortune-teller, a reader of manure. They think I am mad." He drew a long breath, the cold air carrying the clean scent of stone and straw and horse. "Perhaps I am mad. Perhaps my father was mad, and his father before him, all the way back to the first Blackwood who looked at a mountain and saw shelter instead of stone. But madness or wisdom, the cold does not care. The cold comes regardless, and when it comes, I will be ready." He stepped back from Pebble's stall, surveying the space he had carved with his own hands over 2 winters of solitary labor. The feed bins stood full along the northern wall, enough grain for 3 horses through 4 months of isolation. The water trough ran clear and cold from the spring he had tapped in the stone. The timber beams held steady, notched and fitted to bear weight beyond any he expected to face. The wool blankets hung across the entrance, ready to seal warmth inside. His father would have approved. "Let them talk," he said to the empty chamber, to the stone that had witnessed his labor, to the memory of a man who had died saving his son. "Let them measure my work against theirs when the cold comes for what they love." The words echoed briefly in the underground space, then faded to silence. The next afternoon, the trestle fell. Thaddeus did not learn the full extent of the disaster until 2 days later, when Lindqvist's wagon came rattling up the south road with news from town. The Swede's face looked graver than usual, which was saying something for a man who had buried a wife and 3 children before reaching 40 years of age. "The railroad company cannot send repair crews until spring," Lindqvist reported, climbing down from his wagon seat with the stiffness of a man who had spent too many hours in the cold. "The snow has closed the Helena Road as well. 3 feet fell overnight in the pass. We are cut off." Thaddeus absorbed this information in silence. He had expected something like it, had prepared for exactly this possibility, but the reality of isolation still carried weight. How long can the town hold out? 3 weeks of fodder in the granary by the mayor's count. Perhaps less. Lindqvist's eyes moved to the cliff face, to the entrance of the stable visible as a dark rectangle against the red sandstone. "The stock horses will begin dying by Christmas if the weather holds cold." "It will hold cold," Thaddeus said. "Colder than Christmas. Colder than anyone remembers." Lindqvist nodded slowly. He was not a man given to questions, and he asked none now. He simply stood in the thin afternoon light, his breath making ghosts in the frozen air, and looked at the cliff stable that every other soul in Jasper Creek had mocked for 2 years. "You have provisions inside?" "Enough for 3 horses through spring." 3 horses. Pebble, and 2 more if needed. The Swede considered this. His own stock amounted to 4 horses and a milking cow, animals he could not afford to lose and could not afford to feed through a hard winter now that the supply line had severed. "Coldwell is already talking about slaughter," Lindqvist said. "Kill the horses for meat, stretch the grain for the people who remain. He means to propose it at the town meeting tomorrow." Thaddeus felt something cold settle in his chest, colder than the wind that cut across the valley. And the families who depend on those horses for spring planting? Coldwell says they can buy new animals when the railroad returns. Lindqvist's voice carried a bitter edge. He fails to mention that new horses cost more than most families earn in a year. But then, Coldwell has never wanted for money. The irony was not lost on either man. Coldwell, who had mocked Thaddeus for keeping horses underground, now proposed to kill every horse in Jasper Creek rather than consider alternatives. Coldwell, whose prize stable, the finest in 3 counties he often boasted, stood above ground where God intended, where the cold would reach it without obstruction. "I will not give them Pebble," Thaddeus said quietly. "No one will ask you to." Lindqvist's mouth twisted in something that might have been dark humor. "They would have to acknowledge you exist first, and that would require admitting they might have been wrong about something." He climbed back onto his wagon seat, gathering the reins in his weathered hands. "I will bring word after the town meeting, whatever they decide." Thaddeus watched him go, the wagon wheels cutting dark tracks in the thin snow that had begun to fall. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees since morning. By nightfall it would stand at 20 below, and by the following week it would fall farther still, into depths that Jasper Creek had never known. If you want to hear what happened at that town meeting, how the community sealed its fate with the very arrogance that had driven them to mock Thaddeus for 2 years, then you should subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. He turned back to his cliff stable where Pebble waited in warmth while the world prepared to freeze. The following days brought a false calm that Thaddeus recognized from his father's stories. The temperature held steady at 15 below, brutal but survivable, and a few hopeful souls began to suggest that the worst had passed. The sun emerged briefly on the second morning, casting long shadows across the frozen valley, and Niels Coldwell was heard to say that the mole man's predictions had proved as reliable as his building methods. But Thaddeus watched the sky with his father's eyes, reading the signs that others could not see. The clouds building in the northwest carried a particular weight, a density that spoke of moisture gathered across hundreds of miles of frozen landscape. The wind had shifted during the night, coming now from a direction that brought only suffering. The animals knew. Pebble had begun pacing in her stall, restless in the way of creatures who sense danger approaching. On December 3rd, the cold truly descended. Thaddeus woke in his sod dugout to a silence so complete that he thought for a moment he had gone deaf. No wind, no bird song, no distant sound of human activity from the town. Just silence, pressing down like a physical weight, as though the air itself had frozen solid. He dressed quickly, pulling on every layer he owned, and stepped outside into a world transformed. The temperature stood at 34 degrees below zero. His breath crystallized before his face, falling to the ground as fine ice crystals. The moisture in his nose froze with his first inhalation, and he pressed a wool cloth across his face before the cold could damage his lungs. The walk to the cliff stable took twice as long as usual, each step a battle against air that had turned hostile to human life. By the time he reached the entrance, his fingers had gone numb inside his gloves, and his feet had begun to lose feeling despite 2 pairs of wool socks. Inside, Pebble greeted him with a soft nicker. The temperature registered 51 degrees, unchanged from the day before, a pocket of warmth carved into stone, while the world outside froze solid. He spent that day inside the stable, emerging only twice to check the weather and retreating immediately from cold that seemed determined to kill anything that breathed. Through the thick wool blankets that sealed the entrance, he could hear nothing from the direction of town. No voices, no wagon wheels, no church bells, just silence, and the patient cold settling over Jasper Creek like a shroud. The silence would last for 57 days. If you are enjoying this tale of survival and vindication, take a moment to like and comment below with your thoughts so far. Your engagement helps more people discover these stories of perseverance against those who mock what they do not understand. Thaddeus understood what the silence meant. He had heard his father describe similar silences in the old country, the hush that fell over a landscape when the cold became too severe for ordinary life to continue. In such cold, sound itself seemed to freeze, unable to travel through air that had turned to something between gas and solid. He rationed his excursions outside with the care of a man who understood the margin between life and death had grown vanishingly thin. Once each morning, once each evening, he emerged from the stable long enough to check the thermometer he had mounted on a post near the entrance and to scan the valley for any sign of movement. The thermometer's readings charted a descent into the impossible. 34 below on December 3rd, 38 below on December 5th, 41 below on December 9th. On December 12th, the mercury stopped falling only because it had reached the bottom of the glass. 44 degrees below zero. At such temperatures, exposed flesh froze in less than 5 minutes. Metal became dangerous to touch with bare skin, bonding to moisture and tearing away flesh when released. Spit would freeze before it hit the ground. Breath would crystallize into clouds of ice that fell rather than rose. And above-ground structures, the proper buildings that Christians built, began to fail. Thaddeus heard the first collapse on December 14th, a distant cracking sound that carried across the frozen valley like a rifle shot. He could not know then whose building had given way, could not know that the weight of ice accumulating on Jasper Creek's rooftops had begun to exceed what timber and nail could bear. He learned the truth 5 days later, when a figure appeared on the road leading to his cliff face, moving slowly through the killing cold like a pilgrim approaching a shrine. Martha Thornton, the Reverend's wife, came bearing news of catastrophe. Martha Thornton's face had turned the color of old candle wax, white with undertones of gray where the cold had begun to do its work. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes and the strands of hair that had escaped her bonnet, transforming her into something that looked half alive. A woman caught between the warmth of life and the stillness of the grave. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that falling meant dying, that the cold waited for any mistake with the patience of a predator that had already cornered its prey. Thaddeus met her 20 yards from the stable entrance, taking her arm to steady her over the final stretch of frozen ground. She did not speak. Her lips had gone blue, sealed by cold and exhaustion, and he understood that words could wait until warmth had done its necessary work. He guided her through the heavy wool blankets that sealed the entrance, into the pocket of warmth that his father's knowledge had carved from the mountainside. The stable's 51 degrees struck Martha Thornton like a physical blow. She gasped, her body shuddering as the contrast between the killing cold outside and the moderate warmth within registered in her frozen nerves. Pebble watched from her stall with calm curiosity as Thaddeus settled the Reverend's wife onto a wooden bench near the feed bins, wrapping a spare blanket around her shoulders and pressing a cup of water into her trembling hands. "Drink slowly," he said. "Your body needs time to remember what warmth feels like." She drank. For 5 minutes, perhaps 10, she simply sat and breathed and let the earth's patient warmth seep into her frozen bones. Thaddeus busied himself with small tasks, giving her the privacy she needed to compose herself. to find the words for whatever news had driven her 2 miles through temperatures that could kill in minutes. When she finally spoke, her voice emerged as a rasp, scraped raw by cold air and grief. "The Morrison widow is dead." Thaddeus felt the words settle into his chest like stones. The widow Morrison, who had brought him honey cakes when he first arrived in Jasper Creek, who had been the last of the townswomen to exclude him from social gatherings, succumbing only to the pressure of Martha Coldwell's relentless campaign. He remembered her kind eyes, the way she had apologized when she stopped speaking to him in public. How? Froze in her own home. The fire went out sometime in the night and she was too weak to rebuild it. Reverend Thornton found her this morning when he went to check on her. She was sitting in her chair by the hearth, still holding her knitting needles. Martha's voice broke on the last words. The needles were frozen to her hands. We had to break them free to lay her out properly. Thaddeus closed his eyes. The image Martha had conjured would not leave him. The widow Morrison, alone in her darkened house, too cold to move, too cold to call for help, simply sitting and waiting while the cold claimed her 1 inch at a time. He had warned her. He had warned them all. But warnings meant nothing to people who had already decided not to listen. "There are others." Martha nodded, and the motion seemed to cost her something, as though each confirmation of death stole a piece of her own life. Young Thomas Henley, 7 years old. His mother sent him to fetch water from the well on December 15th, before anyone understood how quickly the cold could kill. He made it halfway back. They found him still holding the bucket, frozen solid in the middle of the street. Her hands tightened around the cup Thaddeus had given her. His father has not spoken since, just sits by the fire and stares at nothing. 7 years old. Thaddeus thought of himself at 7, running through the alpine meadows above his father's village, learning to read cloud formations and wind patterns, absorbing knowledge that would one day save his life and the lives of his horses. Thomas Henley had run through the streets of Jasper Creek, absorbing nothing but the certainty that above-ground homes were proper and cave-dwelling was for animals. That certainty had killed him. And Samuel Pine? Trying to save his cattle. Went out to the barn on December 17th when he heard them screaming. The sound carries, even through this cold. Screaming cattle, screaming horses, animals dying in their proper Christian barns. Bitterness had crept into Martha's voice, an edge that cut against the propriety she usually wore like armor. Samuel reached the barn and found half his herd already frozen. He tried to lead the survivors to his house, thought he could save them if he could just get them inside. He collapsed 30 feet from his own door. His son found him the next morning, covered in a 1/4 inch of ice. The cattle were dead behind him, scattered across the yard like broken toys. 3 deaths then. 3 souls claimed by cold that need not have taken them, cold that Thaddeus had warned against, cold that the earth itself offered shelter from if only men would humble themselves enough to accept it. 3 deaths, and winter not yet half finished. The buildings? He asked. Collapsing. The cold does something to the timber, makes it brittle. The ice accumulates on the roofs, layer upon layer, and the buildings cannot bear the weight. Martha looked up at the stone ceiling above her, at the rock that had stood for millennia and would stand for millennia more. The general store roof caved in on December 16th. Half of Polk's inventory is buried under frozen debris. What remains, he is selling at triple the price. Flour has reached $12 a barrel. Salt pork, $18. Families are choosing between food and firewood, and some are beginning to run short of both. $12 for flour that had cost $3 before the cold came. Ezra Polk, who had required Thaddeus to pay cash when every other customer bought on credit, now extracting the last coins from families whose children went hungry. The pattern was familiar. His father had described similar scenes in the old country, merchants who saw disaster as opportunity, who fattened themselves on the suffering of their neighbors. Such men rarely changed until circumstances forced change upon them. And Coldwell? Something shifted in Martha's expression, a flicker of satisfaction quickly suppressed beneath appropriate Christian sympathy. His stable collapsed on December 14th, the great stable, the one he built to house his 14 horses, the finest in 3 counties. She paused, and Thaddeus heard the weight of vindication in her silence. The ice accumulated on the roof for days, and he did nothing. Believed his construction would hold, believed his proper Christian building would outlast whatever the weather could deliver. The roof gave way at 3 in the morning. They found the horses the next day, crushed and frozen. Every one of them dead. His prize stallion, the bay that cost him $400 in Helena, his matched carriage team, all of them, gone in a single night. Thaddeus felt nothing resembling satisfaction at this news. 14 horses, dead, because one man's pride had blinded him to simple truth. 14 animals who had trusted the humans responsible for their care, who had stood in their stalls and waited for shelter that their owner believed they already had. They had not mocked him. They had not coined clever nicknames or organized social exclusions. They had simply been horses, and now they were dead. How many horses remain in Jasper Creek? 23 at last count, down from 62 before the cold came. Most died in their stables, but some families have managed to keep theirs alive by bringing them into their homes. Martha shook her head at the image. The Haversham family has 3 horses living in their parlor. The animals are warm, but the house smells like a barn, and Mrs. Haversham weeps every time she looks at her ruined furniture. 23 horses, 39 dead, and winter still had 8 weeks to run. Why have you come to me? The question hung in the air between them, simple and direct. Martha Thornton had not walked 2 miles through killing cold merely to deliver news of death and destruction. She had come seeking something, and Thaddeus needed to hear her speak the words aloud. Because your horses are alive. Martha met his gaze directly, all pretense stripped away by cold and grief and the simple mathematics of survival. Because you have food and warmth and knowledge that no one else in Jasper Creek possesses. Because my husband sent me, but I would have come regardless. Because I remember the day Niels Coldwell stood in the street and called you a mole man and a fool, and I said nothing. I let his wife convince me to stop inviting you to church suppers. I let the town decide you were not worth knowing because it was easier than defending you. She set down the cup and folded her hands in her lap, a gesture of supplication that looked foreign on a woman who had spent her life organizing others. I am asking for help, not for myself, for the families who have nowhere else to turn. If you are captivated by this tale of survival and redemption, please subscribe to the channel and share this story with others who appreciate narratives of perseverance and justice. Your support helps us continue bringing these tales of human resilience to a wider audience. Thaddeus considered the woman before him, the Reverend's wife who had once been kind and had allowed herself to be made unkind by social pressure and neighborhood gossip. She had come to him now, in the depths of winter, because the alternative was watching more of her neighbors die. It was not forgiveness she sought. Not really. It was survival, offered in terms that allowed her to keep some fragment of her dignity. He thought of his father, buried beneath snow in an alpine pass, giving his life so that his son might carry forward 4 generations of knowledge. He thought of the widow Morrison, frozen in her chair with knitting needles still clutched in her dead hands. He thought of Thomas Henley, 7 years old, still holding the water bucket when the cold claimed him. How many families can travel? Martha blinked, clearly expecting negotiation or conditions, or, at the very least, a moment of righteous satisfaction. I do not understand. How many families have horses or mules still living, capable of pulling a wagon through snow? How many have children too young to walk 2 miles in this cold? How many have elderly or infirm members who cannot be moved without assistance? The practical questions seem to orient her, giving her something concrete to consider instead of the abstract weight of shame and apology. Perhaps a dozen families can travel on their own. Another 8 or 10 would need assistance. The rest— She spread her hands helplessly. The rest have no means of transport and nowhere to go, even if they could travel. Begin with those who can come on their own. Send them here in groups of 3 or 4 families, spaced throughout the day. I can shelter their horses and show them how to construct emergency earth-banked structures near their homes. The stable is not large enough for 62 horses, but it can serve as a teaching space, a demonstration of principles that can be applied elsewhere. You would teach us, after everything that was said, everything that was done? My father taught me that knowledge kept secret helps no one. He learned to shelter livestock from his father, who learned from his father before him. The Blackwood family did not survive 4 generations in the Alps by hoarding what they knew. They survived by sharing it, by teaching their neighbors, by understanding that a community that thrives is worth more than an individual who prospers alone. Martha Thornton's eyes had begun to fill with tears, though whether from relief or shame or simple emotional exhaustion, Thaddeus could not say. Coldwell will not come. He will not humble himself to learn from the man he called a fool. Then Coldwell will continue to lose what he values. I cannot force knowledge upon anyone. I can only offer it to those willing to receive it. Thaddeus moved to the feed bins, extracting a portion of grain for Martha to carry back with her. Take this. Give it to whichever family has living horses and empty bellies for them. Tell them Thaddeus Blackwood extends an invitation, nothing more. Those who wish to learn may come. Those who prefer to cling to their pride may stay home and hope the cold relents before it takes everything they have. Martha accepted the grain with hands that trembled only slightly now, warmth having done its slow work on her frozen extremities. She stood, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, preparing herself for the brutal journey back to a town that had spent years teaching itself to despise the one man who could help them. I will tell them, she said. I will tell them what you have offered, and I will make certain they understand what it cost you nothing to offer it. She paused at the entrance, one hand on the heavy wool blankets that separated the stable's warmth from the killing cold beyond. Your father would be proud of you, Mr. Blackwood. Whatever Coldwell said about him dying before he could teach you sense, he was wrong. He was wrong about everything. Then she was gone, slipping through the blankets into the frozen world, carrying grain and hope and news of a man who had chosen kindness over justified resentment. Thaddeus watched the blankets settle back into place, then turned to Pebble, who had observed the entire exchange with the patient attention of a creature who understood far more than most humans gave her credit for. They will come, he said quietly, running his hand along her neck. Some of them, at least. And we will teach them what we can, and hope it is enough. Pebble snorted softly and returned to her hay, unconcerned with human matters of pride and reconciliation. She was warm, she was fed, and the cold that raged outside could not touch her. The rest was noise. The first families arrived the next morning, appearing on the road like refugees from a war zone, bundled against cold that bit through every layer of clothing. The Lindqvist wagon came first, the Swedish widower driving with 2 other families crowded into the back among blankets and supplies salvaged from collapsing homes. Their horses, a bay gelding and a dun mare, both showing ribs where weight had fallen away over weeks of insufficient feed, moved with the careful steps of animals who had learned to fear the frozen ground. Thaddeus met them at the entrance, directing them to bring the horses inside first, settling the animals in the warmth of the stable before attending to their human charges. The bay gelding began trembling as soon as it passed through the blankets, its body responding to warmth it had not felt in weeks, warmth it had perhaps stopped believing was possible. The mare was calmer, older, accepting the change in circumstance with the stoicism of an animal that had survived previous hardships and would survive this one as well. Over the following days, more came. If you have enjoyed this story so far, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the community's transformation. Your interaction tells the algorithm to share these tales with more viewers who appreciate stories of resilience and redemption. The Peterson family arrived with 3 children under the age of 10, all of them hollow-eyed and silent in the way children become when they have seen too much death too young. The elder Peterson worked as a carpenter, and he studied the stable's construction with the intensity of a man who recognized that his professional assumptions had been fundamentally wrong. "The joints," he kept murmuring, running his hands over the timber supports Thaddeus had set into the stone. "The way you anchored them to the rock rather than the ceiling. I would never have thought to do it this way." "My father learned from watching Roman ruins," Thaddeus explained. "The old builders understood that stone does not move, does not shift with seasons, does not fail when ice accumulates above it. They let the mountain hold the weight, and the mountain does not grow tired." Peterson nodded slowly, and Thaddeus saw understanding begin to replace confusion in the man's weathered face. This was how knowledge passed between generations, not through lectures or books, but through demonstration and observation, and the slow accumulation of practical wisdom. The Haversham family arrived with their 3 parlor horses on December 23rd, the animals following their owners through the snow with the desperate trust of creatures who sensed that their survival depended on human decisions they could not influence. Mrs. Haversham still wept at intervals, mourning her ruined furniture, her destroyed carpets, her home transformed into a barn by necessity. But she wept less when she saw her horses settle into the stable's warmth, when she understood that the sacrifice of her parlor had not been in vain. By December 28th, 17 families had made the journey to the Cliff stable, bringing with them 19 surviving horses and a hunger for knowledge that cold and death had finally made urgent. Thaddeus organized them into work crews, teaching earth-banking techniques that could be applied to existing structures, showing them how to read the signs that presaged dangerous weather, explaining the principles his father had learned from generations of alpine survival. The cold did not relent. 39 degrees below zero on Christmas morning, 42 below on New Year's Day. The thermometer climbed briefly to 31 below on January 5th, a warmth so relative it felt like spring, then plunged again to 40 below as January wore on. And still, inside the Cliff stable, the temperature held at 51 degrees, the earth keeping faith with those who had built with her rather than against her. The silence continued to press down on Jasper Creek, broken only by the cracking of ice and the occasional distant sound of another building giving way. But now the silence held something else, something that had not been there before. It held the sound of hammers and shovels as families worked to earthbank their homes. It held the quiet conversations of neighbors sharing food and firewood. It held the beginning of something that might, in time, become a different kind of community. And still, Niels Coldwell did not come. The sharing continued through January, though Thaddeus would not have called it sharing. He would have called it sense. The 17 families who had made the journey to the Cliff stable settled into a rhythm that emerged naturally from necessity, the kind of organization that appears when people stop fighting against circumstance and begin working with it. Each morning before dawn, Thaddeus assigned work crews. The Peterson family, with the carpenter's understanding of joinery, took charge of teaching earth-banking techniques to those who would eventually return to their homes. The Lindqvist clan, hardened by generations of Scandinavian winters, managed the rotation of horses through the stable's limited space. The Haversham children, surprisingly resourceful once their mother stopped weeping over lost furniture, became runners and messengers between the various families, their small bodies nimble on the packed snow paths that connected the cliff stable to the emergency shelters being constructed nearby. The grain held. The spring-fed trough never froze. The earth, as Heinrich Blackwood had promised his son so many years before, kept faith with those who built with her. By the first week of February, Thaddeus had taught 37 adults the basic principles of underground shelter construction. He showed them how to read sandstone layering, how to identify natural water seeps, how to calculate the depth required for temperature stability. He explained the mathematics of insulation, the engineering of drainage, the art of ventilation that kept air fresh without surrendering precious warmth. Some took to the knowledge eagerly, asking questions, making notes, returning to practice techniques until their hands learned what their minds had grasped. Others listened with the dull patience of people who would forget everything the moment danger passed. Thaddeus taught them all the same. The death accounting continued as well, though no one spoke of it directly. Word filtered in from the town proper, carried by those brave enough to make the journey between settlements. The final toll would not be known until spring, when the snow melted and revealed what the cold had hidden, but the numbers already whispered through the community carried weight enough. Thomas Henley, 7 years old, dead fetching water his family could not spare him from fetching. Widow Morrison, frozen in the home that had once seemed so solid, her body not discovered for 3 days. Samuel Pine, 62 years on this earth, perished trying to save cattle that died anyway. The Garrett infant, born too early into a world too cold, surviving only 6 hours before the temperature took what little strength she had. Old Man Hutchins, the land agent who had laughed at Thaddeus 8 years before, found sitting upright in his office chair with his ledgers open before him, as though he had simply fallen asleep over his accounts and forgotten to wake. The horses fared worse than the humans, in raw numbers if not in grief. Of the 62 horses that had stood in Jasper Creek when the trestle collapsed, only 23 remained alive by February. 39 animals frozen in stables that their owners had believed adequate. 39 bodies that would need to be disposed of when the ground thawed enough for burial. Coldwell's 14 prize horses among them, including the black stallion he had purchased from Helena for $400, the finest animal in 3 counties, now stiff and silent in the wreckage of a stable that had cost more than Thaddeus's entire cliff structure and lasted not a single hard winter. The contrast was not lost on anyone. Thaddeus's stable, carved by hand over 2 winters for $127 in materials, sheltered 19 horses through temperatures that killed everything above ground. Coldwell's stable, built by professionals using the finest methods and materials available, collapsed under its first serious ice load and took every animal inside it to frozen death. The families who sheltered with Thaddeus spoke of this contrast in hushed tones when they thought he could not hear. They marveled at the stable's warmth, at the steady 51 degrees that held regardless of what the sky inflicted upon the world outside. They studied the construction with new eyes, seeing now what they had mocked before, understanding what their derision had cost them. "We called him the Mole Man," Mrs. Peterson whispered to her husband one evening, thinking Thaddeus was out of earshot. "We laughed when Coldwell said his father died before teaching him sense, and now, look where we are standing. Look at what he built while we laughed." Peterson had no answer for her. There was no answer to give. February gave way to March, and the cold began at last to loosen its grip. The temperatures climbed from murderous to merely brutal, from 40 below to 30 below to 20 below. Each degree of warming felt like a reprieve from a sentence of death. The snow stopped falling with such relentless frequency. The wind calmed to something less than a constant assault. The earth began, in its slow and patient way, to remember that spring would eventually arrive. And on the 3rd day of March, Niels Coldwell came to the cliff stable. He came alone, without his wife, without the coterie of followers who had once laughed at his jokes and repeated his clever nicknames. He came on foot, his fine coat hanging loose on a frame that had shed weight through weeks of insufficient food. He came with his hat in his hands, his silver hair exposed to the cold, his face carrying the marks of sleepless nights and grief he had not known how to express. Thaddeus met him at the entrance, neither welcoming nor hostile, his expression as neutral as the stone that surrounded them. "Mr. Coldwell," he said. "Mr. Blackwood." Coldwell's voice had lost the booming confidence that once carried across saloon tables and town meetings. It emerged now as something smaller, rougher, scraped raw by cold and regret. "I have come to. I would like to." He stopped, unable to find the words. Thaddeus waited, saying nothing. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft sounds of horses breathing in the warm stable behind. "May I come inside?" Coldwell finally asked. Thaddeus stepped aside without comment, holding the heavy blankets open so Coldwell could pass through. The builder entered the cliff stable and stopped, his eyes adjusting to the lantern light, his body registering the warmth that surrounded him. He stood very still for a long moment, looking at the smooth stone walls, the carefully fitted timber supports, the horses standing healthy and calm in their stalls. Then his shoulders began to shake, and Niels Coldwell, master builder of Jasper Creek, wept like a child. Thaddeus let him weep. He did not offer comfort or condemnation, simply waited until the storm of grief had passed and Coldwell could speak again. "I would like to call a gathering," Coldwell said at last, his voice thick with tears he no longer tried to hide. "Here, in this stable. Everyone who mocked you, everyone who followed my lead. I want them to hear what I have to say, and I want them to say it too. Will you permit that?" Thaddeus considered the request for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly. "The gathering may come in March," he said, "when those who need to speak have found the words." The gathering came on the 15th of March, when the worst of the cold had passed but winter still held the land in its grip. They came in ones and twos, families who had sheltered with Thaddeus, and families who had clung to their pride until pride nearly killed them, all of them filing into the cliff stable that they had once called a folly and a tomb. 43 souls crowded into the chamber Thaddeus had carved from living rock, standing among the horses and the feed bins and the timber supports that had held when every other structure in the territory had failed. They stood in silence, waiting, their breath visible in the lantern light despite the stable's warmth. Thaddeus stood at the back, near Pebble's stall, his calloused hands folded before him. He had asked nothing of them, demanded nothing, required nothing. He had simply opened his door and let them come. Now he would let them speak or remain silent as they chose. Niels Coldwell stepped forward first. He moved to the center of the chamber, where everyone could see him, and he did not try to hide the trembling in his hands or the moisture in his eyes. "I called this man the Mole Man," Coldwell began, his voice carrying through the stone chamber with none of its former arrogance. "I stood in the saloon and said that any fool who puts horses underground deserves to bury himself with them. I said his father died before teaching him sense." He paused, drawing a ragged breath. "I said those words, and men laughed, and I was pleased with myself for being clever. Then the cold came, and I watched my stable, my fine stable that cost more than this entire cliff, collapse under ice weight. I heard my horses screaming as the roof came down. 14 animals, including a stallion I paid $400 for in Helena. Dead, all of them dead in a single night, while this man's horses stood warm and safe in the very ground I mocked him for using. Coldwell's voice cracked. He paused, visibly struggling to continue. I lost everything I valued: my horses, my reputation, my certainty that I knew better than everyone else. I spent weeks watching other men learn what this man was willing to teach them, and I was too proud to ask for help, too proud to admit that I had been wrong about everything. Thaddeus Blackwood did not let me freeze. He did not turn me away when I finally came to him. He let me into his stable, the one I called a folly, and he let me stand where my horses could have stood if I had not been too arrogant to learn from a man I dismissed as a fool. Coldwell turned to face Thaddeus directly, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. I ask your forgiveness, Mr. Blackwood, for the nickname, for the laughter, for saying your father died before teaching you sense. I was the fool. I was the one without sense, and I do not deserve your mercy, but I am asking for it anyway. Silence held the chamber. Thaddeus nodded once, acknowledging that he had heard, but said nothing. Ezra Polk stepped forward next, the general store proprietor who had demanded cash payment, and called Thaddeus by Coldwell's cruel nickname. I made this man pay cash when I gave credit to everyone else, Polk said, his voice smaller than Coldwell's, but no less weighted with shame. I called him Mole Man to his face, right there in my store, in front of other customers. I thought I was being funny. I thought I was putting him in his place. When the cold came, I raised my prices. $12 for a barrel of flour that used to cost $3. $18 for salt pork. I told myself it was business, supply, and demand, nothing personal. But people died. The Garrett baby might have lived if her parents could have afforded proper food. Old Man Hutchins might have lasted longer if he had not been rationing his meals to make his money stretch. And all the while this man I had mocked was sharing his grain freely, teaching anyone who asked, asking nothing in return except that they be willing to learn. Polk's voice broke. I have no words adequate to what I did, but I ask your forgiveness, Mr. Blackwood, knowing I have not earned it and may never earn it. Again, Thaddeus nodded without speaking. Martha Coldwell came forward third, her fine clothes hanging loose on her frame, her face stripped of the social confidence she had once wielded like a weapon. I organized the women to exclude him from everything, she said, and her voice held no attempt at excuse. The harvest dance, the church social, every gathering that mattered. I told the widow Morrison to stop bringing him bread, told her she was lowering herself by showing kindness to a fool. I made certain this man had no friends, no community, no welcome anywhere in Jasper Creek. And the widow Morrison died alone in her home, too proud to ask for help, because I had taught her that asking for help was weakness, because I had taught everyone that kindness to the wrong people was shameful. Tears streamed down Martha Coldwell's face. I cannot undo what I did. I cannot bring back the widow Morrison. I cannot restore the years of loneliness I inflicted on a man whose only crime was building something I did not understand. I ask your forgiveness, Mr. Blackwood, but I do not expect you to grant it. I would not grant it in your place. Peterson the carpenter spoke next, his weathered hands twisting his hat as he struggled to find words. I laughed, he said simply. Every time someone told a joke about the Mole Man, I laughed. I did not coin the name. I did not organize the exclusion. But I laughed, and my laughter gave permission for others to be cruel. I did not defend this man when he warned us about the winter. I did not listen when he tried to share what he knew. And now my children have seen things no child should see, and my family owes its survival to the man I thought it was funny to mock. I ask your forgiveness, Mr. Blackwood, for the laughter, for the silence when I should have spoken, for all the small cruelties that I told myself did not matter. And then finally, Everyone had spoken who wished to speak, and the chamber fell silent, and 43 souls turned their eyes to Thaddeus Blackwood, waiting to hear what judgment he would render. He stepped forward slowly, moving to stand where Coldwell had stood, where all the confessors had stood. His hands remained folded before him, his face calm, his eyes reflecting lantern light from stone walls he had carved with those same hands. My father used to say that the earth forgives us for building against her by teaching us to build with her instead, Thaddeus began, his voice quiet but carrying through the chamber. He said this in the high valleys of the Swiss Alps, where our family had sheltered livestock in mountain caves for 4 generations. He said it the day he first placed a chisel in my hand, and he said it again the morning he died when he pushed me into a rock crevice and covered the opening with his own body, so that I might survive the avalanche that killed him. I have thought about forgiveness often since that day. I have wondered what it means to forgive someone who is beyond hearing it, and I have wondered what it means to be asked for forgiveness by those who did me wrong while expecting no consequence for their actions. I cannot grant forgiveness for words. Words belong to those who spoke them, and only those speakers can reclaim them or release them. I cannot absolve any of you of what you said or did or laughed at. That absolution is not mine to give, and you would not truly receive it even if I offered it. What I can tell you is this: my father did not teach me to shelter livestock underground so that I could prove my neighbors wrong. He taught me because his father taught him, and his father's father taught him. And the knowledge existed not to benefit a single family, but to be shared with anyone wise enough to receive it. The Blackwood men did not survive 4 generations in the Alps by hoarding what they knew. They survived by teaching, by sharing, by understanding that a community that thrives together is worth infinitely more than an individual who prospers alone. You mocked me. You excluded me. You called me names and made certain I had no friends and no place in the life of this town. And when the cold came, I shared what I had anyway, because that is what my father taught me to do, and because I would not have been worthy of his teaching if I had done otherwise. I will not say I forgive you. I will say instead that I will teach anyone who wishes to learn. The earth endures, and those who build with her rather than against her will endure as well. If you wish to learn, I will teach you. If you wish to share what you learn with others, I will help you share it. And if you wish to remember this winter as the season when Jasper Creek learned to build differently, then I will help you build. That is all I have to say. He stepped back to his place beside Pebble's stall, and the gathering began to disperse, each soul carrying away whatever portion of his words they could hold. Subscribe to this channel and tap the bell icon to see new stories when they post. I would love to hear in the comments which character's confession moved you most deeply, and whether you think Thaddeus should have spoken the words of forgiveness they wanted to hear. The years that followed transformed Jasper Creek in ways that the railroad's arrival never had. Thaddeus spent the spring and summer of 1888 teaching, traveling to outlying farms and settlements, showing anyone who wished to learn how to read the land and build with it. He asked no payment, though many families insisted on providing meals or labor in exchange for knowledge that might save their lives in winters yet to come. By the autumn of 1890, 27 cliff stables and earth-sheltered structures had been carved into hillsides throughout the Montana Territory, each one built by hands that Thaddeus had guided, each one following the principles that Heinrich Blackwood had brought from the Swiss Alps. The builders called their work Blackwood Burrows, taking the mockery of the Mole Man nickname and transforming it into something respectful, even reverent. Niels Coldwell became, perhaps surprisingly, one of the most dedicated students. The master builder who had once dismissed underground construction as folly spent 3 years learning everything Thaddeus could teach him, then spent another decade refining the techniques and adapting them for different stone types and soil conditions. He never rebuilt the above-ground stable that had collapsed. Instead, he carved a shelter into the hillside behind his property, smaller than Thaddeus's original but built with the same principles, and his horses survived every winter that followed. "I was wrong about everything," Coldwell told anyone who would listen, and he said it so often and with such evident sincerity that it became a kind of catchphrase in the territory. When you hear someone say that building underground is foolish, you tell them Niels Coldwell said the same thing once, and his horses paid for his arrogance with their lives. The coin phrase itself, building like a Blackwood, entered the vocabulary of 3 counties by 1895. What had begun as mockery became method, then tradition, then simply the way things were done in country where the earth offered shelter to those wise enough to accept it. Thaddeus married late, at the age of 39, to a schoolteacher from Helena who had heard stories of the Mole Man and traveled to Jasper Creek to see his work for herself. They had no children of their own, but they adopted 4 orphans over the years, teaching each one the principles of earth building, along with reading and arithmetic and the other skills they would need to make their way in the world. Pebble died in the spring of 1904, at the age of 23, an extraordinary span for a horse and a testament to the care Thaddeus had given her. He buried her at the entrance to the cliff stable, marking the grave with a sandstone slab carved by his own hands. The inscription read simply, "She trusted the earth. The earth kept faith." Thaddeus himself lived until the winter of 1931, dying peacefully at the age of 63, surrounded by the 17 families he had taught to read the mountain and the 47 structures their hands had carved into stone across the territory. His funeral was held inside the cliff stable, by his own request, and more than 200 souls crowded into the chamber where he had once sheltered alone. Over 200 cliff stables and earth-sheltered structures stand throughout the Montana Territory now, collectively called Blackwood burrows by all who build and use them. The techniques have spread beyond the territory, carried by students who learned from Thaddeus or from those who learned from him, reaching into Wyoming and Idaho and the Dakotas and beyond. Each builder adds something, refines something, adapts the principles to local conditions and local stone. But the foundation remains what Heinrich Blackwood taught his son in the high valleys of the Swiss Alps, what Thaddeus taught to everyone willing to learn. The cliff stable still stands, maintained now by the great-grandson of Niels Coldwell, a young man named Henrik, who never knew either his great-grandfather or the man who taught him to build differently. Henrik tends the stable with a reverence that borders on religious devotion, repairing timber supports as they age, keeping the spring-fed trough clear, ensuring that horses shelter there through every winter, just as they have for nearly half a century. Above the entrance, carved into the sandstone in 1889, an inscription remains legible despite decades of weather and time. Thaddeus carved it himself, working by lantern light over 3 winter evenings, choosing each word with the care of a man who knew that stone holds what is given to it for longer than any human life. The inscription reads, "The earth endures. Build with her." It is, word for word, what Heinrich Blackwood said to his son the day he first placed a chisel in a boy's small hands in a mountain valley on the other side of the world, in a life that ended so that another life might continue. Henrik Coldwell does not know this history, not in full, but he traces the carved letters with his fingers sometimes when he visits the stable, feeling the grooves that Thaddeus's hands made, connecting across decades to a man he never met. Heinrich Blackwood, who died beneath an avalanche with his body shielding his son, would have recognized those words. He would have understood that his teaching had not ended with his death, that the knowledge he passed to Thaddeus had been passed onward in turn, that the earth endures and those who build with her endure as well. He would have been proud,